Hello and welcome to today's presentation, Understanding the Cannabis Regulations and New License Categories. Today's webinar is being presented by Virox Technologies, makers of Shield disinfectants formulated with accelerated hydrogen peroxide. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation today by typing them into the chat section located on the right-hand side of your screen. So without any further ado, let's get started. I would now like to introduce David Brown, Cannabis Policy Analyst, Cannabis Regulatory Advisor, and Director of StratCan Services, Inc.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for tuning in today. Today, I'm going to be speaking a bit about some of the myths and realities of the cannabis licensing process, especially looking at some of the micro and nursery categories, which are some of the newer categories created in the wake of legalization. As with many things related to cannabis, there's often a good deal of misinformation and confusion that can lead people to operating in or looking to operate in the cannabis space, making poor decisions. And so I'd like to address some of the common misconceptions, as well as talk about the foundation and background of the broader cannabis regulations and the Cannabis Act that informs them. This understanding of the foundation and context of the Cannabis Act and cannabis regulations can help in better understanding and interpreting the cannabis regulations, and therefore understanding how to navigate the licensing process. The categories like micro-cultivation and processing and the nursery license category can represent an excellent opportunity for small businesses to enter the cannabis space, and to do so will require separating fact from fiction and coming to understand and read the following regulations in a way that will guide both your application as well as hopefully your licensed business. Also, first, as some background about myself, my name is David Brown, and I've been following cannabis policy advancements in the cannabis space for some time, and began following legalization here in Canada, starting in around 2012, the first publication of the then MMPR regulations, which came into force a few years later. In 2014, I teamed up with the founder of Lift Cannabis to help build out our collective vision of a singular platform that could better inform and connect patients with licensed producers and physicians. In 2018, I took a position as a senior policy advisor with Health Canada's legalization and regulation branch at the time, as an advisor on the formulation of the regulations, as well as working with external engagement to reach out and communicate about those regulations to various levels of government and community organizations, especially here in British Columbia. And that's really just a lot to say that with my time at the branch from 2018 until earlier this year in 2020, I did a lot of reading and writing and consulting with people in the industry and with the people within the regulatory branch at Health Canada who are helping to guide those regulations. So in my time with the regulatory branch in that work that I did in communicating those regulations to the general public, I would often have this opportunity to give a talk about really what the government's goals with legalization are. And when discussing this subject or anything to do with the Cannabis Act and the regulations, I found that it's important to first look back at the intentions and goals behind these regulations. So as I mentioned earlier, understanding the context of the regulations will help in reading and understanding those regulations and the licensing process that it helps inform it. And before we can discuss the way things are, it's important to understand why it is that they came about. So one of the talks that I often gave to these different audiences when discussing my work with the legalization branch was always looking at these goals and really emphasizing that the government's goals with legalization really didn't have to do with revenue generation, taxation, or even really freedom and liberty. It was much more about issues of public health, limiting access to young people, and a strict regulatory control of the supply chain from the seed to sale. My point in starting off with this foundation was always to help people not only getting a better understanding of why the government was legalizing, but also how to better formulate critiques of legalization and how to navigate the regulation process. So that is to say, without understanding the goals and priorities of legalization and the legislation behind it, you cannot effectively navigate it. So when discussing these specific license categories like micro and nursery, I think it's important to understand how to read these aspects of the regulations and how to understand them and how to read between the lines. And that is how to know the context and intent of these cannabis regulations, and the different license categories within them. So what's one of the important pieces is to understand is the first regulatory regime for cannabis in Canada, for commercialized cannabis in Canada, was the MMPR, which later formed into the ACMPR. And one of the many complaints leveled at the time was the cost of compliance for one who wanted to participate within this industry. The cost of building a facility that could adhere to the strict high bar of those regulations at the time was often said to be too expensive, too overbroad for many of these small mom and pop farms that grew cannabis commercially in Canada, either supplying their local community dispensaries or as an alternative to the larger legal corporate regimes. And these concerns were really they're not unfounded. The cost of adhering to regulations circa 2015 under the MPR, for example, requirements like massive vaults, highly advanced security systems, cameras, infrared sensors, large fences and thick walls, and a significant regulatory oversight often meant that building a facility could be, at the very least, several $1 million, if not tens of millions of dollars. This is, of course, not the rule in every case, and even in those early days of the MMPR, one can find many examples of very successful small businesses that did it with a much smaller footprint. But in general, adhering to those regulations was often a lot more significant than people who were operating in the underregulated or illicit market were able to navigate. And so when putting together the regulations that would eventually become the cannabis regulations, which came into force in 2018, one of the issues considered was this knowledge that there was a need to address this regulatory burden and allow for a way for these small farmers, again, people who were telling us they were small mom and pop operations, to find a way to get licensed and to take part in legalization. And that is a way for them to transition away from what they were doing in the illicit market into the light, so to speak, and a way for them to not just grow, a way for them to just grow cannabis, as many of them said they wanted to do. And so not become large-scale processors or even large-scale growers, but just people who are good at growing cannabis or processing small batches of edibles, chocolates or candies, all at a very small craft scale. And envisioning this, there was a recognition from the government and from policymakers tasked with coming up with this new regime that overall the regulations and a lot of the intent behind them was not going to become dramatically lessened. The security concerns alone, especially for much larger facilities, often growing and in possession of finished products worth millions of dollars, were obviously likely not to be dramatically changed. And to address this, there were a handful of proposals, including the idea of dividing up what was at the time just one standard license, a license to produce, or an LP, and separating those into separate categories that could be done individually or combined. And so by doing this, this provided a way to allow someone who just wanted to grow cannabis and not have to invest in any aspects of processing just to adhere to the licensing requirements. And similarly, those who wanted to just process raw cannabis but didn't want to waste their time at the cultivation side of licensing at all, provided an opportunity for those individuals to still apply without having to add all of those additional costs and fees associated with license categories they weren't going to be using. But this still only addressed a one-size-fits-all approach to both of these categories, the cultivation and processing. So to further create even more opportunity and to further create opportunity to scale back some of these associated costs of things like security requirements, some other license categories were conceived of, such as micro-cultivation, micro-processing, cannabis, and cannabis nursery licenses. And so the idea behind these subcategories was that a license holder who was the kind of mom and pop that the branch had been hearing about for years, who was growing perhaps a more limited amount of cannabis at a more smaller craft scale, that there could be a justification for allowing even lower security requirements because they would have less product on site. And so that is to say, if you only have a relatively small amount of plants and dried flower on hand, then the risk of theft is theoretically much lower than someone with several times that amount. And therefore, security requirements don't need to be seen as quite as robust. And so requirements that were standard earlier on, such as visual monitoring for a micro-cultivation facility, were removed, leaving behind only the requirement for, say, simple perimeter security of, say, a fence or a wall. Another known cost for licensed producers was the requirement for a trained quality assurance professional on site. And finding someone to fill that role with the right experience and training can be a very costly endeavor, depending on where you live, upwards of $100,000 a year or more. So this was another example where the microcultivation category, the regulator was able to identify aspects of those regulations that could sort of be pared back. And so by allowing microcultivators to not be required to employ a QA, this was another way to trim back those costs. And the logic here is that the way these license categories work, if you have a cultivation license, you still have to be selling to a processor. And if you're selling to a processor, that processor is still required to have a quality assurance professional. And so the idea is that any processor who's buying from a cultivator is going to ensure that that cultivator is utilizing processes that are going to allow them to follow their own SOPs at the processing site, and therefore that microcultivator can lean on the quality assurance professional at the processor that they're selling to. So with these two fairly big pieces sort of cleaved off from what was these traditional LP licenses, the idea was that a micro license holder could get to the point of having a license, not to mention managing these day-to-day operations, while investing far less than someone who was applying for, say, a 100,000 square foot facility. So in addition to that, the actual cost of licensing was brought down, since the idea was it was easier to process an application for a smaller facility and easier to inspect one once it was licensed. And so the cost of applying for a micro, we can go back and look at these slides here. The cost of applying for a micro in terms of regulatory fees can be from around $6,000 to $12,000 compared to around $30,000 or more for a standard licensing fee. And so you can get an example here of some of those application fees, and you can see, an application fee for a micro or cultivation, processing, or nursery is around $1,600, and this is in comparison to much more for those standard licenses. So similar to those micro categories is this idea of cannabis nursery license. And part of the idea behind the cannabis nursery license was a way to create a supply for these growers who are looking to only be growing flower and want someone else who can supply them genetics to operate with. But another piece of that nursery license, in addition to supplying those commercial operators, was ensuring that those people who are growing at home their 4 legal plants, depending on their provincial regulations, have access to a safe and legal supply as well. And so part of the idea behind a cannabis nursery license was not only cannabis nurseries that can be supplying into the commercial stream, but cannabis nurseries that could eventually, with provincial and municipal approval, potentially even be sort of cannabis garden centers where someone could go in person, buy cannabis seeds, cannabis clones, soil, shovels, nutrients, everything. And so if we move on to the next slide here, and the concept of these nursery centers, this idea that there's a need for people to bring in genetics, new genetics into the market, and through the licensing category, there's this opportunity called a Section 10 allowance that allows any new license holder, be they standard, micro, or nursery, to bring in genetics in sort of a no questions asked scenario, where they can bring in seeds and clones and enter them into the legal market, so that there is a wider array of genetics and cultivars beyond the limited amount that was available prior to legalization. And so it's important to understand that when looking at some of those license categories, such as a nursery, again, you see a much more pared down requirement in terms of quality assurance, in terms of security requirements, compared to, say, a larger producer. But it's also important to understand that whereas a micro is limited to 200 square meters of cultivation space, a nursery can really be any size, from very small to very large, and therefore those security requirements will fluctuate depending on the size and scope of the infrastructure. Okay, so that's a bit of background on some of the intent and goals of those regulations, as well as some examples of those license categories and the goals that went into creating those. Another piece that's important in understanding the background intent of the regulations is looking at some aspects of how regulations are put together in Canada. And so on this screen, we're going to look at some examples here through the slides of outcome-based versus prescriptive regulations. And when reading and seeking to adhere to the regulations, it's important to understand how to read them, how to understand the intention of those who wrote them, and what it is they're seeking to convey. And so one of these key pieces is this idea of outcome-based versus prescriptive-based. So outcome-based regulations refer to regulations that describe the desired result for regulated parties to meet, rather than specific means by which they need to be achieved. So on this slide here, we can see some examples the government gives, juxtaposing these outcome-based and prescriptive-based regulations. So on one hand, the prescriptive regulations that give the regulated party a very specific set of guidelines to adhere to. And this can give a very clear idea of what is and isn't allowed, but it also means that the regulated party is required to toe a very narrow line. And so there's an opportunity to have the safety and security of knowing exactly what you need to adhere to, but at the same time, one of the limitations is that's a very narrow line of what you can adhere to. So the opposite is this idea of outcome-based regulations. And what this allows is the regulator to give a more broad outline of the intent, the desired outcome, while still giving the regulated party more room to interpret those regulations as they see fit and as is applicable to their own individual circumstances. Break. So when reading the cannabis regulations, it's important to keep this distinction in mind, that the regulations are not always telling you exactly what to do, but they're often giving you a desired outcome that is up to you to justify and adhere to within your own standard operating procedures. And this is a key point when it comes to understanding what is being asked of you when you are applying. And I have some examples later that will help illustrate some ideas of what this means. And so with all that said, I hope this gives a bit of understanding of why these categories exist, what the government's goals and priorities are in legalizing, in creating and maintaining them through legalization. And it's important to see these categories, such as micro and nurseries, not necessarily as limitations, but as a starting point for those who are not able to access the funds and resources in order to get started in this space. It's also important, anytime I'm talking to anyone about these micro categories, is this idea that you really don't need to see it as locking yourself within that 200 square meter approved canopy. Ultimately, a micro license can be seen as sort of a stepping stone. And so if you want to enter into this category and stay at that small scale, the micro category allows for that. At the same time, there's always the opportunity to expand one's business and apply for a license amendment and really move beyond that. And in fact, we've seen now the emergence of at least one sort of micro cultivation center where we see 2 micro cultivation licenses on one site, as well as a nursery, with the idea that this person can operate a handful of these small micro businesses with the nursery feeding into those licenses all together. And then again, if at some point in the future they want to expand beyond those 2 separate 200 square meter rooms, they can potentially even apply for an amendment to that license and become a standard cultivator. So with all of that said, I would like to get into some of the myths and misconceptions, the truths and realities of the licensing process. And so one of the important and very common myths that still perpetuates 2 years into legalization is this idea that micros have to sell to LPs. And so when looking at this, you have to understand that standalone cultivators, and we've talked about this earlier, standalone cultivators are required to sell to a processor to get their product to market. This doesn't mean that micros are somehow beholden to larger licensed producers, especially since there's currently well over 200 different processing licenses of all different shapes and sizes out there that anyone with a cultivation license can potentially build an arrangement with. At the same time, micro cultivators have the ability to apply for their own processing license that can allow them to apply for sales amendments for products where they do not need to rely on an outside processor and can do all of their own processing themselves. And so rather than looking at the idea that a micro cultivator or a standalone cultivator of any kind has to sell to another processor, really a better way of looking at it is it's not a requirement to be vertically integrated. And if you only want to cultivate, you have the opportunity of building a relationship with these outside processors. And that brings us to the next myth, which is this idea that it will take several $1 million just to get into the cannabis space. And this, again, is a very common myth that sort of is a holdover from those early pre-legalization days for the commercial medical cannabis regime under the MMPR and the ACMPR, that, it would take several $1 million, often tens of millions of dollars to get a facility. But what we've seen with these micro license categories already is that we've seen several examples now. I'm aware of at least 3 different standalone outdoor cultivators who are able to get their license for around $15,000 to $20,000. That includes their licensing fees, some of the costs of retrofitting an existing infrastructure, maybe erecting a fence. Doesn't include land costs because these are individuals who already own their land. But nonetheless, we're able to get through the entire licensing process for around $15,000 to $20,000. There are also many who have spent well over $100,000. I know a few who spent upwards of $2 million on their micro cultivation and micro processing facility. But really, these are costs that are more associated to the scale and sophistication of the facility you want to build, rather than fees that are really connected to the actual licensing process, which we talked about earlier, is really around $5,000 to $6,000 to maybe $10,000 or $12,000. And so obviously, as with any regulated industry here in Canada, there is a fair amount of costs associated with it, but these costs are really quite comparable to many of the other costs that you'll see, from a host of different industries, from agriculture to brew pubs to coffee shops. So another myth that is often still heard these days, there's often a belief that you have to hire a consultant. And that's absolutely not necessary. And in fact, there are many people who have gotten through the licensing process doing the entire process themselves. And it can take a little bit of extra time. And certainly there are, skilled, honest, informed consultants out there who can be very helpful through that licensing process. But if you are looking to get a license through for a fairly low cost, and you want to really understand the licensing process so that you can understand how you're going to be regulated once you're licensed, one of my recommendations is really to do as much of that work yourself, and do as much of that work as you can on your own, and get to those points where you have questions or concerns. And then if you need to reach out to a professional, it can be a more targeted bit of help, rather than just kind of handing over the work to someone else, paying them a fairly large sum of money, and then not really getting the benefit of understanding that process. So that's to say that it's not a business requirement, but if you do your homework, it can certainly be very helpful to bring someone in. So one of the other, not a myth, but a reality of the licensing process is that these smaller license categories, but really applies to even standard license categories, is this idea to start small and build out. And I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot of these new license holders post-legalization really learning is that, as opposed to what we saw in the sort of stock.com run-up of large facilities with references to funded capacity of several 100,000 square feet, really what that is going to do, if you're trying to take that approach, is just ensure that you are indebted to outside funding, and maybe not having enough control of your own facility. And so the ability to start small, be it through a micro or even a standard cultivation or processing license, can be a great way to really sort of prove your business model out, keep your costs low, and really work towards a more sustainable model. And a lot of the businesses that we've seen succeed historically within the cannabis industry are those businesses who have taken those small steps. And if we look at some of the examples in the publicly traded companies, of those companies that grew very fast, ultimately we've seen a lot of examples of these very large facilities closing down because they're just not able to produce quality cannabis at that scale. And so, any of these license categories can be looked at really ultimately as a foot in the door and getting yourself regulated. And then as you figure out what you want to do, what you do well, and what the market demands are, then you can start to pivot and grow if you want. So this brings me to another reality, which is that the regulations are not detailed advice. And so this goes back to this idea of these previous points about outcome-based versus prescriptive regulations, but just understanding that the regulations are not telling you exactly what to do. The regulations are there to guide you. You're still going to have to develop your own SOPs and show that you can follow them. but really, that process of reading through the regulations and filling out the application through the CTLS, you need to be able to show not only that you're just filling out a sheet, but show that you can understand the intent behind that and communicate that to the regulator. So one of the examples I mentioned earlier was this idea that for a micro license category, there is no requirement for visual security, but there is a requirement for perimeter security. And so often a question I hear people asking is, well, what is the government looking for? They say I need a secure perimeter, but what does that mean? And so the example here is that ultimately it's up to you to communicate to the regulator that your perimeter is secure. And so the regulator may have very targeted questions for why you've taken the approach you've taken, but this is an example of something that doesn't need to be overthought. A secure perimeter can be something as simple as a chain link fence, potentially barbed wire, but it doesn't mean that you need laser motion detection centers. If you're an indoor facility, you potentially don't even need that chain link fence as long as your walls are secure and only allowing authorized people in. And so when you're looking at something such as the requirement for a secure perimeter, try to look at it in terms of not necessarily the least you can do, but what you can do that's site appropriate, that's going to adhere to why it is the regulator is asking you to do that. So the regulator wants, in that example, to show that your perimeter is secure, that no one can get in. So if you're in an area that can utilize existing infrastructure like walls, or potentially you're in a rural area where maybe you've got a large cliff on one side, or exists something else that could sort of prevent people from getting in, then you can utilize that space as well. And so this brings me to one of my next points, is this idea that the regulator is your enemy. And as we talked about earlier, these regulations they exist to ensure that these license categories and businesses can operate within them. And so the regulations do not exist, and the regulator does not exist to prevent you from getting licensed. They're there to ensure that those who are getting licensed are following the rules and producing a product that is safe for public consumption. But the regulator is not there to make you fail. And I think oftentimes, especially within the cannabis space, there's often this sort of adversarial role with government, with regulators, and for often many historically understandable reasons. But really, the regulator is there to try to help you get licensed as long as you're really following the regulations. And so the process of applying, the process of the back and forth that you will have with the regulator once you've applied through often requests for more information, can really be seen as that opportunity to work with, rather than a consultant, working directly with the government. So you put in your application, you show your SOPs, you show your intent of why it is you've taken certain paths forward. And if they have those questions, they're going to reach out and ask those questions of you. And so, they're there to kind of work with you and guide you through that process. They're not there to help you get licensed. You need to show that you're able to do this, but they're not there to stand in your way either. So that brings me to one of the other realities of the licensing process, and that's that in addition to not sort of overthinking and overbuilding, is really keeping all of those costs low. Micro cultivators and nurseries have very low security requirements, and a micro is designed to be able to run on a very small staff of maybe 2 or 3 people. I've talked to several license holders in the micro category who have a team of maybe 3 people, a master grower, head of security, responsible person in charge. And often these individuals are wearing sort of multiple hats. And so understanding that you don't need to go out and hire a whole bunch of people. You don't need to hire someone to manage your website or your social media. Try to keep that burn rate as low as possible. Embrace that sort of startup DIY culture, and prove your profitability before you start expanding. Because ultimately the cannabis industry is not the stock market boom that we've seen in the last few years. This is a regulated commodity, and there's a need to really keep your costs low if you're going to survive long-term selling cannabis and not just selling stocks. So one of the other myths I think has been somewhat dispelled at this point but there's still often a bit of confusion, and this is this idea that farm gate sales are not allowed. In understanding why it is that they're allowed, the federal regulations really make no say one way or the other in terms of what provincial models for sale are going to look like, as long as they are allowing the sale of a federally regulated product. And so how provinces establish and manage their retail system is provinces and territories is essentially up to those provinces and territories. And so a farm gate model is an example where a province has the ability to allow for these on-site or so-called farm gate sales that would allow for someone with the appropriate federal licensing, which would be a processing and sales license, to be able to potentially set up some sort of store on their property and sell that product as a retailer from their farm. And we're seeing some examples of this. We've seen British Columbia signal that they are looking at this in the next couple of years. And in fact, Ontario has said they're ready now and have established that as a license category and are just waiting for people to apply for it. So this is something that is allowed, and I think we will see down the road. The other half of that, though, is to understand that farm gate is not going to be a panacea. If you have a successful business, farm gate is probably going to potentially be something that can really help. But if you're relying, putting all of your eggs in that basket and relying on that, that may not be the one thing that kind of gets you through the licensing process. And the other piece of that is, as I mentioned, through the federal regulations, the standalone cultivator is not able to sell directly into the provincial system. So anyone who does want to get into farm gate will have to be looking at the processing license as well as the individual sales amendments that go for each of those products that they're going to be selling. So one of the other pieces I talked about earlier, this idea of the genetic transfer under the Section 10 allowance. When you apply, you can do this one-time declaration for any starting materials. And this allows new license holders to bring in, frankly, anything they want in terms of genetics, as long as it's not flowering material. And we're seeing a lot of license holders really making advantage of this and bringing in sometimes thousands of different cultivars that they're, the plan is to slowly pheno hunt and test those out and try to see, what works and where the market demand is. And we're really already starting to see a lot of new strains, new cannabis varietals coming into the market that were, previously only seen in the black market and are now starting to make their way into the legal system. And so this is something that can give, in a lot of ways, a great advantage to these new license holders who are coming in. That this is, frankly, an option that was more or less not available for any license holders prior to legalization. And so it's something that, because you get to do it only one time at the time of licensing, I think it's a good idea to really, do your homework beforehand and ensure that you can make the best use of that licensing option. So another aspect, another reality of the licensing process is that long-term viability. So, this is only speculation on my part, but as the cannabis market in Canada matures, I think consumers will continue to demand higher quality products. And I really feel strongly that these smaller producers who can keep a lower burn rate and can take the time to focus on quality and not quantity are going to have an enormous advantage over these much, perhaps better financed, much larger producers who really do not seem to be able to scale that kind of quality. And so while these larger producers are forced to focus on these rapid timelines to satisfy a lot of outside investors, what we're seeing with smaller micros and frankly smaller standard license holders who've remained privately funded, that they have a lot more ability to really control the quality of their product, the quality of their brand, and ensure that they're only putting quality products out on the market. And as the supply of cannabis available increases, we're seeing prices declining. But where we're not seeing prices declining is in those high quality products that we're seeing from some of these smaller producers. And so while there may be a drive to the bottom in terms of pricing for a lot of the much larger scale producers of maybe $1 or $2 a gram wholesale, we're still seeing that people who are producing even at a small scale but a high quality are bringing in closer to $3 to $5, maybe even a little bit more dollars a gram wholesale. And so really the long-term viability, in my opinion, for these smaller license holders, I think there's a lot of opportunity compared to what we're seeing with some of these bigger guys. So this is another piece of the once licensed, that I think a lot of new license holders are not really taking into consideration. Some of the complexities of the supply chain. So growing cannabis in the black market, it can be relatively easy. You grow it, you harvest it, you sell it to a broker, and you're given, pretty much just given cash and on your way. And for those who are transitioning from this way of doing business into a legal, fully regulated supply chain, there's often a lot of new steps, new costs, and logistical challenges that they're unfamiliar with. And so any new license holder who's coming from that space, that's one of the pieces of advice that I like to give, is really preparing for these additional aspects of the supply chain, budgeting for them, understanding what timelines will be for compensation. If you're selling into a province, there can be 90, 120, 160 day turnaround on payment. You're not getting paid right away. And so, taking the time to budget for that, just because you harvested your crop in, say, October, and it's ready and sold into the system by November, you might not be paid until January or February. And so being prepared for that. Some other aspects of that system that people need to be more prepared for, especially at the smaller scale, is that the provincial buyers hold a lot of power at this point. And so, one of the issues we're seeing right now is they have established a somewhat arbitrary threshold for what they consider quality of anything over 20% THC. And so we're seeing prices based on if anyone is able to get over that 20% mark. So if you were at 18 or 19%, you might see a much lower price per gram wholesale purchase as opposed to something at 20, 21%. And that's something that, hopefully will evolve, but right now is sort of a barrier that producer or these provincial buyers have put into place. And another thing to take into mind is that these provincial buyers are really motivated in terms of logistics to focus more on much larger producers who can guarantee a long-term supply. And it's taking them a little while to understand how to work with smaller producers with smaller batches, perhaps 50 or 100 kilograms at a time at a less consistent basis. And so for these smaller producers, one of the pieces of advice that I often like to remind them of is, it might not be that easy to get your product into the market. And that goes back to that idea that you don't necessarily need to be vertically integrated, and working with processors who already have those relationships with provincial buyers can often be very beneficial. And so if you want to just focus on growing, ensuring that you develop some relationships with processors who have a relationship with buyers so that you have a way to more easily get your product into the market. And so with all of that said, I hope that gives a bit of a better understanding of some of the government's goals and intentions behind legalization, as well as a better understanding of what some of these new license categories are and how to navigate that licensing process with an understanding of those goals and intentions, understanding the difference, for example, between outcome-based versus prescriptive-based, understanding the goals of the government in legalizing, and therefore understanding how to present your own application in a way that shows the regulator that you understand those goals. And being able to effectively communicate that can really make the difference between a successful application and an unsuccessful application. And so with that said, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions anyone has, and I will be around here for a while to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I know I found that very informative, and I'm sure everyone in the audience did as well. So there's one question that you began answering already in the chat. So let's start off with that one. So the question is, would you have any idea as to why no micro license has received a sales amendment?
Yeah, so there is actually one micro processor who has a sales amendment for a few different products, and that's a company called iNaturally Organic in Alberta. But to speak to the larger question of why we aren't seeing more, there's no one simple answer. There are many micro cultivators who aren't looking to get their sales amendment or their processing license. They're only looking to cultivate. And in fact, that's sort of the bulk of the micro licenses or micro cultivators who are just looking to specialize in cultivation and looking to work with a processor who can help get their product to market. In addition, the process of getting a sales license can be complicated and take a bit of time. Each sales license, each product that you're selling requires a sales license. And so that requires a lot of additional logistical challenges and can take 2 months or more for each product. So for example, if you have your processing license and you are selling, say, 5-gram containers of dried flower, you have to have all of those products packaged beforehand, written into your SOPs, showing exactly what that will look like before you can even apply for that 60-day notice that you provide Health Canada. And so it's a timely and somewhat costly process that many are working their way through right now. But there are also many who are just simply choosing to stay on the cultivation side and work with someone else who has a sales license.
Great. Okay, so we have 2 questions kind of regarding square footage. So one of them was, I thought nursery licenses were limited to 50 meters squared, and then kind of maybe a follow-up to that one, any chance the square footage for micros may increase?
Yeah, so in regard to the nursery license, the 50 meters squared limitation is only for flowering material for the purpose of seed production. So there's no size limitation on a cannabis nursery. And in fact, there are some very large, there's 10 official cannabis nurseries right now, and a few of them are actually quite big. And so there's no limitation as long as you're only growing non-flowering, cuttings or clones. The reason for the limitation in the 50 square meters of flowering space for seed production is that there's a lot lower security requirements for a nursery, and a large quantity of flowering material would essentially require additional security requirements. So that's why there's that limitation. But if you are growing just for clones, there's no size limitation. The second part of that question, the chance of increasing the square footage for micro, it's certainly possible. I don't have a crystal ball. My opinion is that it's pretty unlikely to change anytime soon. There's a lot of specific reasoning that went into the formation of that 200 square meters that deals with some of the reasons I talked about in terms of being able to sort of pair off certain aspects of those licensing requirements, like security requirements. And so as soon as you start raising those limits, if you were to move from, say, 200 to 400 square meters, it might be very difficult to justify some of the lower security requirements. The one caveat that I give there is that for anyone who wants to move beyond that 200 square meters, just look at a standard cultivation license. A standard cultivation license is not one size fits all either. And so while there's a few additional requirements, like you have to have a QA on staff, and you will be required some things like visual security, it's still there's still a huge difference in terms of what those requirements will be if you are at, say, 400 square meters, maybe 10,000 square feet versus 100,000 square feet. And so it's really important that people not, and this is something I see often, is people look at micro as the only way that they can get into the industry. And so they feel that maybe that 200 square meters is preventing them from succeeding. If your business plan requires you to be growing in a canopy of more than that 200 square meters, I would just look at the standard cultivation license. The other piece of advice I always give here is, even if you see yourself wanting to move beyond that 200 square meters, a micro can still be a great place to start. And while there's no guarantee that you can get a license amendment to move beyond that 200 square meters to go from a micro to a standard, it can be as simple as just a license amendment if your site can allow it, essentially. So if you want to start at 200 square meters, kind of work that out for a year or two or 6 months or whatever, figure out your logistics, and you decide, okay, I need to expand beyond this, it can be as simple as just a site amendment at that point. And then just sort of growing your footprint from there. So don't look at that 200 square meters as a limitation. Look at it as a starting point.
Great. We've got a bunch of questions rolling in here. I'll try to start from the bottom. So one more. Do you think the ACMPR will be phased into micro?
Yeah, I saw that question, and that's a good question, and it requires a bit of unpacking. So the ACMPR itself no longer exists. It's often used as shorthand to refer to personal and designated medical growers. But when the Cannabis Act came into force in 2018, it replaced and repealed the ACMPR. So all medical licenses now occur under the Cannabis Act. With that said, often what people are referring to, and I suspect what that person asking the question was referring to, is this idea that, there's a lot of people growing under those medical licenses who maybe wanted to transition into the commercial space. And there are certainly a few organizations out there that are really touting this as something that they're lobbying for. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but my opinion is that it's pretty unlikely for Health Canada to make any changes to those licensing requirements that would allow someone who is not licensed for commercial sale, and those so-called ACMPR growers, those designated and personal medical producers, are not licensed for commercial sale. And so the idea that there will be a change that will allow them to sell into the system with a much lower regulatory barrier than any commercial producers, I think is pretty unlikely, and I think is a bit of a misdirection. And I would personally not really follow anyone who's suggesting that that's something that is going to happen anytime soon. In addition, just the bigger picture there is any major changes like that to the regulations are incredibly unlikely before the upcoming regulatory review that begins in October of next year, and is then an 18-month process that will culminate with a tabled report in the House of Commons in around April 2023. And so any substantial changes like that would be very unlikely to happen before 2023.
That's great. I didn't know about that review.
Yeah, the review is a big thing, and I really like to point people to that now is the time to begin building up evidence if there is something about the regulations that you think need to be changed. That review will open up no later than October 17th of 2021. And then, like I say, there'll be that 18-month public review. There will likely be, public roundtables, depending on where we are with COVID at that point, public or online roundtables, the opportunity to send in white papers. And so if you want to see changes to the regulations, take this year or so to really build robust evidence-based arguments to be able to submit them. And that, to me, is the most effective way to push for change, as opposed to, petitioning or lobbying the government and other methods at this point.
For sure. I completely agree. Okay, so one other question we got. What is the timeline for bringing in the one-time genetics / starting materials? How long after receiving a license is that allowed?
So when you receive your license is when you need to declare those. So you need to have all your ducks in a row beforehand. That's why it's the one-time allowance. So when you actually get your license, you have to show them a complete list of everything you're bringing in. You also have to show CRA, who will come in usually a few days after your license. And this is really important. I've had a lot of people ask, well, can I kind of, work in a gray area around those rules? CRA will come in and physically count all of those seeds, all of those plants. So if you brought in, 50,000 pink Kush seeds, they're going to sit there and count each of those seeds. And so it's really important that you keep really careful records. And as I say, it's a one-time transfer. So at that point of licensing, what you bring in, and then that's it. And so there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of pheno shopping beforehand, bringing in genetics from a whole host of sources, even with the idea that they may just keep them sort of banked in the back for several years before they really try it out, because it's that you get to do it only once.
I think that definitely answers the question. That's good to know. So a little bit of a longer one now about the processing license. So for a micro processing license, I see there is a 600 kilogram limit. I thought I read somewhere that if a micro cultivation license is on the same site, there is no micro processing limit. If this is true, can a microprocessor process at no limit from the micro cultivation license and also accept up to 600 kilograms from others?
Yes, that's correct. So the 600 kilogram limit for a microprocessor is only a limitation applied to what you're bringing from offsite. So if you have a micro cultivation and a microprocessing license together on the same site, there's no 600 kilogram limit. There's no kilogram limit in terms of how much you can produce under a microcultivation license. You can produce as much as you can produce within that 200 square meters. If you're processing your own stuff under a microprocessing license, again, no limitation. So that 600 kilograms is just to ensure that you're not allowed to bring in anything from offsite more than 600 kilograms, with the reasoning being that it's, to maintain the integrity of a small micro license. And so if you want to be bringing in more than 600 kilograms annually, you should definitely apply for a standard processing license.
Perfect. So there's one question here that I've seen kind of talked about a lot in the industry recently. So what can be said about the variances in test results seen at the different testing facilities?
Great question. There's not a simple answer. I actually have done a few, myself and a few of my writers at stratcan.com have done a couple articles on this in the last few weeks. There is a fair bit of variance in the methodology used by labs. In addition, there are often different demands made by cultivators and processors. And so really it's up to the lab or up to the cultivator or processor to really vet the lab that you're using, to really understand the processes that they're using. There's really two standard approaches to those processes, and sometimes a mixture of those two, depending on what pharmacopoeia they're using. And so really, I encourage you to call around to several labs. Health Canada has a list of about 125 analytical labs right now. A big chunk of them do external testing for other licensed producers. They're all very eager to chat with people. And so I would just get on the phone. That Health Canada list has phone numbers for each of them. And I would just call around and really talk to each one, understand their methodology, and talk to other producers as well. Producers are often very happy to help each other, especially other micros. And so I would talk to them, see what kind of experiences they're having with their labs. And just, you want to feel very confident that the lab you're using is using a methodology that's something that you could stand behind.
That's great. I hear a lot about not only that, but even people waiting a lot of time in labs as well. So I think it's great for everyone to know that. So a little bit off topic, but can you speak to the viability of a cannabis nursery? So will there be a sustainable market, or do you see a sustainable market for selling clones and seeds in the future?
I do, but I think that's a smart question, because I do think that the market will change quite a bit in the coming years in terms of where the demand is for those products. I think we will see a trend of the larger nurseries who are serving the B2B market. So those nurseries who are supplying other commercial growers. Personally, I think there will be a trend towards tissue culture clones. It's just much easier, much more standardized, smaller, easier to ship, and that's really what's used in pretty much every other similar agricultural industry. So I think any nursery that is looking to serve the B2B market needs to be aware of that trend, and it may be very difficult to compete if you're a small nursery producing clones in a more traditional fashion. That said, there will likely be a demand for that as well for a lot of the smaller micros who maybe aren't looking for the kind of capacity that these larger nurseries will be providing. The other side of that is, and this is something I touched about in my talk, is in creating that nursery license, it was not just about B2B sales. It was also an understanding that there would be an opportunity for B2C sales straight to the consumer market. And as provinces begin to allow those on-site farm sales or farm gate sales, I think there's a lot of opportunity there for nurseries to supply over-the-counter seeds, clones, and all sort of garden center equipment, soil, shovels, nutrients, all those things. And what I envision as being very successful in different markets will be a consumer-focused nursery. So someone who's not even looking at B2B sales, someone who's just selling those seeds and clones and all those additional products to consumers. And I think there's a huge opportunity for that. And I think that will only continue to grow once we see those provinces allowing for those kinds of sales. So that's something, again, those farm gate sales completely allowed as far as the federal regulations go. Sales are up to the provinces. And so anyone who's looking to do those farm gate sales should be engaging very consistently with their province, as well as ensuring they're talking to their municipality to make sure that where they are is currently zoned properly for that, and that there won't be any hangups if and when the province says, okay, we're going to accept these kinds of sales. You want to make sure that you've got all of your ducks in a row in terms of your conversations with the municipality up to that point.
I think that whole idea of a cannabis garden center is awesome. Like somewhere, not only you can go kind of a trusted source to get everything you need, but a lot of these new growers have questions too. So even, if you're asking what size pots or soil, like just having somewhere you trust and some good information, I think if it does go that way, I think that'd be great for the industry and all the consumers.
Absolutely. And right now and up until now, the only similar model I think that you could compare is grow stores that have not necessarily sold seeds and clones, but have sold lights and nutrients and soil and all these things. And it's where growers often go to kind of have those to talk shop and to discuss different options. And I think that what I see the potential to evolve with that nursery model is that taking it one step further. And so I think people who are maybe in that space already, running kind of a nutrient shop or a light store, should maybe look at the potential of are we properly zoned? Could we maybe get a nursery license here, or could we work with another nursery so that we're selling their products? I think there's enormous opportunity, and I think as more sort of hobbyist growers come into this space who don't have a lot of experience with cannabis, who are looking to just maybe grow 4 plants in their backyard, they'll really be looking for someone to hold their hand through that process.
Yeah, for sure. I see it all the time. I know some friends who just kind of thrown some seeds in their garden, hope for the best, and it doesn't work like that, and they need some help. So I think that'd be great if the industry could go that way.
Another piece I'll just add in there too is the federal regulations also allow for essentially drop shipping for any kind of producer, be they a cultivator, a processor, or a nursery. And so one of the other pieces, and in fact, we've seen this with one medical platform now who's working with a few of the nurseries to sell clones online in sort of a drop shipping option. So you're buying it from the online source, but then it's being shipped directly from the nursery. And that's something I've had talks with a couple different provinces about allowing within the recreational stream as well. They're a little hesitant, but the regulations will allow for it once the provinces allow for it. So maybe you don't necessarily even need to start with an over-the-counter nursery. You can be drop shipping those so that if you say live in New Brunswick, you go to the online New Brunswick store, you pay for the clones there, but then the nursery ships them directly to you. And so that's something that I think people should be, if you're really looking to get those into the consumer market, that's an option that you should start raising with your province as well.
Yeah, I think on this topic as well, we have a question about someone who wanted to start growing starter plugs for people to grow for home use. So I'm assuming this is someone who wants to grow maybe 8 clones and give them to his friends or whatnot. Does this fall under any licensing category?
So if you're just giving them away, if you're not operating commercially, the only limitation is the 4 plants. So you can give away up to 4 plants at a time, non-flowering. But if you want to just grow for your neighbors, you can give up to 30 grams of flower. You can give up to 30 seeds at a time. You can give up to 4 plants at a time. And in fact, you can give up to 4 plants really a day. So if you've got, a whole neighborhood of people you want to serve and you want to just start handing out plants, you could be giving each of those individuals 4 plants a day.
The second you take money, I guess, is then when it's a crime?
Exactly. And in fact, the regulations even specifically prevent you from tending to someone else's plants, even for no compensation. So if your neighbor has some plants and he goes away for the weekend and they ask you to water them, technically that would be illegal. And with the idea being that they're really trying to get away from any kind of model where people could find workarounds to kind of operate commercially while pretending that they're not.
I see. I can see how that could get out of hand. You have one guy in 4 people's backyards growing, that's 16 plants, right? So
exactly.
I can see that.
I see another question about the nursery and cultivation license at the same time. So there is someone actually who does have a nursery and 2 micro licenses together on the same site. The only requirement is that they have to be separate addresses. So if you are, the site that I'm referring to is kind of a business park, so that each building has, 135A, 135B, 135C. You can have different licenses at the same location as long as they are separated by address. And in fact, for a micro, having a nursery on site can make a lot of sense because then your 200 square meters on the micro side can be dedicated to flower. And you can ensure that your starting materials aren't eating into that 200 square meters.
Yeah, sounds like a smart way to do it. So I think we're pretty close to running out of time. I'll leave you with one more question. If you were going to be licensed soon, I'm going to assume for like a standard cultivation license, what are the 3 things you would want to be sure to include in your declaration?
Sorry, repeat the question again.
If you were going to be licensed soon, what are the 3 things you would be sure to include in your declaration?
So I assume that's referring to that one-time genetics declaration. I'm not sure I could really say, 3 things to include. I would say taking the time to bring in as many, a wide of array of genetics as you possibly can. It's certainly a no questions asked scenario. So where those genetics are coming from is not Health Canada or CRA's concern. That said, anything that you're buying from the black market, you're still taking that risk in terms of RCMP. But Health Canada and CRA aren't going to ask any questions. So I don't know if there's 3 specific things I would say, but taking the time to pheno hunt, to source out those genetics that you think are not only something that you're really interested in, maybe have some confidence in being able to grow, but you think will be satisfying a gap in the market right now. 2 years ago, prior to this declaration, there was a very severe limitation in terms of genetic diversity. We're seeing that change already because so many new license holders have brought in a lot of new genetics. But, there's a lot of unique stuff that is not yet available on the market. And if you have those kinds of connections, especially in the international space, and you're willing to take those efforts to reach out to those companies, I would say, take the time to find something very unique that you can bring in as wide of an array as possible so that you can really pheno hunt through those and get the strongest genetics possible.
I completely agree. I think that's great. So there are some other questions. We're out of time now. David, what's the best place for people to find you, follow you, maybe follow up with some other questions?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me, you can email me always at david@stratcan.com. So that's strategy in cannabis, STRATCANN.com. You can also read a lot of our coverage at stratcan.com, where we have a lot of interviews with license holders who sort of talk about their experience. In addition, you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I think you can just search for me, probably David Brown Cannabis on LinkedIn. On Twitter, my handle is 1DROWBB, or you can just probably search David Brown Cannabis as well.
Well, that is great. And that is all the time we have for today. So thank you so much, David, for an amazing presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to visit shield.ca. And today's webinar was recorded. I saw that question come up quite a few times in the chat. So you will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to watch the recording, and as well as a registration link for our next webinar in November. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you next month.